Good morning. Today is December 8th, and in the 2 weeks that from the last recording, I could actually assert that much in the world has changed. And because of these changes, I want to start off very generally in terms of the state of the international system, and towards the end, talk about some more specific issues. So the war in Ukraine continues, and the new quote-unquote war in Venezuela is amongst us. But the President of the United States has said of Europe that in Europe you have a civilizational erasure taking place. And what he means by that is one obvious thing and one less obvious thing. What he means is that Europe is increasingly also turning away from being mainly European whites and is becoming, like the United States and some other countries, racially mixed. And in Trump's terms, this essentially means there's the end of the European civilization, unless some of the right-wing political parties in Germany, France, and so forth, England, come into power and rescue this civilizational change in the way that Trump is trying to rescue the United States by getting rid of as many people of color as he possibly can to restore whiteness to the United States. And he claims this is not an argument about race, but civilization. And if the European system has this civilizational change, then we also have reason not to have anything to do with Europe in the future. This sort of sounds either silly or serious, but look what he's saying. What he is saying is that the post-World War II period, 20th century, but mostly post-World II 80 years, have come to an end. And that the US is not necessarily feeling itself aligned with either the Europeans, as in NATO, or for that matter, international UN institutions, for example, the various specialized agencies that I've called for, but also, for example, we did not go to the climate change conference, which took place in Brazil. We didn't even send a formal representative. We feel similarly about other institutional mechanisms. Trump has already said some months ago that we really don't want anything to do with the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court anymore. But now we don't want anything to do with some of the UN institutions that we used to be a party of. And we certainly will re-examine our relationship to NATO. That started a few weeks ago when we said that our contributions to the NATO support of the Ukraine would go away. And it's not clear, as I record this, whether he intends to have very much to do with the future of NATO. Now, these are all sort of specific instances, and they're sort of happening almost every night on the news. But what this essentially means is an erosion now, or the death knell, really, to the international system that we were all used to. The US sees itself as a dominant country in the world. It recognizes that China and Russia are also major actors, but its integration politically, to some extent, but certainly militarily through NATO and through alliances with Europe will come, if it hasn't already come, to an end, because Europe is no longer the Europe that we're used to, and its European civilization, Trump claims, is on the chopping block of coming to end. Somehow, the more diverse populations in various countries are not expected to or able to, it's never clear in what he says, to integrate into those societies and continue to make the societies functioning as they have been for decades now. This is not only serious racism, this is serious unraveling of the international system and Americans' role in the international system and its participation in the international system. Superficially, this doesn't sound very serious, but actually it is very serious, because in the last few weeks it could be said that any semi-serious person arriving from Mars would say that the international system as we have known no longer exists. Now, I'm exaggerating somewhat because some of these assertions on Trump's part have not as yet fully come to pass. But to some extent, they have come to pass because, for example, we say, well, we support the Ukraine and the future of Ukraine, but we're also saying, it's sort of propaganda on our part because the Europeans will now have to take the burden of dealing with the Ukraine or any other situation. Now, I don't want to overstate this because, of course, Trump mentions a potential rescue plan, and the rescue plan would be that right-wing parties in various European countries would come into power, and they themselves would clean those societies of the riffraff from the rest of the world, and would protect protect European countries in the way that Trump is protecting the United States from all these foreign influences. I can't overstate how historic all of this is in the cumulative sense, and how not only the verbiage, but the actual actions that Trump is engaged in is fundamentally now changed the international system. Now, in general, when there are changes, they're evolutionaries. They take place bit by bit, and at some point, the changes are sufficient to say we now live in a new international system. And I want to assert today that unless something happens or gets reversed, we're very close to saying not only that the post-World War II system is eroding, but that the post-World War II system, as we know it, has come to an end, or will be coming to an end in the weeks and months that we're dealing with here. You can say, well, a lot of what Trump is saying is sort of garbage, but it isn't garbage in the sense that there's financing involved, there's military involved, and for that matter, there's even domestic international policy involved. I've mentioned before that Trump has said that we're radically reducing, the number of asylum people that we're taking into the world. But he also said, you will recall, that the priority will go to white South Africans. In other words, if white people want to come to the United States and seek asylum, they may do so. Now, why would South African people be seeking asylum in the United States? Well, he says, they are at risk in the Black racist South Africa. Now, in South Africa, the white population is, roughly speaking, 7 or 8% of the population. And you may recall that until Mandela came along and you had a black takeover of the society. The society was run by these people, right? The Afrikaners, with the help of some English-speaking whites, essentially controlled South Africa, and black South Africans had relatively little role in the management of their own societies. So now black South Africa, or all South Africans, are in charge of their own societies. But according to Trump, white South Africans are facing genocide. By the way, it is demonstrable that that is not the case. It is the case that some white South Africans are getting killed, but so are black South Africans, because South Africa has a very high murder rate. And that includes both whites and blacks. These are criminal activities, robbing people, shooting people, and so forth. So the current South Africa is a quite violent society, but it is not that whites per se are targeted. Nor is it true to say that whites have their farms taken away from them. They still own 2/3 of all the farm land and plantations. So some of this is based on patent lies, but it sounds reasonable to the United States, and it certainly sounds reasonable to a Republican administration and even Congress who believe that people at risk ought to be candidates for asylum. And then you add the people at risk who are candidates for asylum are not the people from, let's say, Afghanistan, who worked with the US military and were promised that they could come to the United States because they're politically at risk in Afghanistan because of their connection with the American military in Afghanistan during the conflict. But those people now can't come in. And the excuse, of course, is the murder by an Afghanistani of the two individuals. Well, one has died, the other is still in the hospital, by an Afghanistani. And now all Afghanistanis are at risk at being returned to Afghanistan, and certainly are not, their asylum claims have been put on hold even when they're not being deported, although deportations have started, by the way. And while it's relatively clear to any sane person that the particular Afghanistani who committed these crimes was a perfectly reliable Afghanistani working with the US military who came to the United States and probably due to his war experience became mentally ill, and his actions are attributable to his mental illness rather than the unreliability of all the Afghanistani refugees. So we are having layers and layers. One, we disaggregate ourselves from the world. Two, a whole bunch of countries can no longer, people from those countries, 19 countries, can no longer even apply for asylum, much less getting it. People who are already in the country are being chucked back out of the country. And when a crime from a mentally ill person takes place, thousands of people are at risk of being returned to Afghanistan, where their own lives will be at risk again. It is totally crazy and crazy making, but it is meant to sound very logical. Trump is protecting us, and the Trump administration is protecting us from the nefarious bad actors internationally. And of course, as the Trump administration is getting more and more isolationist and cutting its ties with former allies and accusing all kinds of countries of being bad actors, he is essentially charting a domestic politics which is highly discriminatory and highly discriminatory of people of color. Now, it's worth remembering that a fair chunk of our fellow citizens, and perhaps some of you listening out there, saying, oh my God, our country is changing, there are more people from all over the world. And we don't want people from all over the world. We're nice white and black from slavery days Americans. Who needs all these other brown people coming from various parts of the world? The trouble with that, or as I said, maybe 50% of our fellow citizens think that, the trouble with that is that whenever waves of immigrants came to the United States, roughly speaking, the same thing was said about them, and probably about your relatives and ancestors, as is now being said. And those relatives and ancestors were not people of color, brown people. They were Italians, they were Irish, they were Hungarians after 1956, and so on. So whenever waves of new immigrants come, there is a move in the United States by a portion of our own population which says, we don't want those people. Those people are criminal, or they're polluting our societies and our culture. Now, the only difference now is that color and racial background is being added to the kinds of prejudices that we have seen before. So then we look at the Western Hemisphere. And of course, the Western Hemisphere has a fair number of, populations, indigenous populations, and they're people whose ancestors were, let's say, from Africa, Brazilians, all kinds of people in Central America who can be tagged as being people of color of one kind or another. Well, we certainly don't want those people either, because who knows? I mean, they're polluting our culture, they're polluting the United States. They don't even bother learning English. All of these prejudices, by the way, were adhered to by other immigrant groups throughout the 20th century and even the late 19th century. The various quotas for immigrants that were developed in the early 20th century all had attachments that sounded pretty much like the attacks nowadays, only they had to do with religion and language and so forth. So I'm not claiming these kinds of prejudices are a first in the United States, but they have taken on a larger role in terms of immigration, and they have taken on a racial component. What's interesting, of course, is that the United States in particular, and much of Europe, is in an aging cycle, and more jobs aren't being filled by quote unquote Native Americans. So if you go to factories, if you go to nursing homes, if you go to hospitals, big chunks of the staffing are not, born white Americans, but rather people of color who may or may not be citizens at this point, who are badly needed to service our economy and our needs. And that is, at the lower level. At the higher level, you might have noticed that many of the doctors in our local hospitals and throughout the United States are people of quote unquote color, people who are Indian, people who are Chinese. And there too, we're trying to make difficulties for them of not wanting to give them visas, or making it more difficult for people to get visas or to stay in visas. If you're an Indian American doctor, and you are now facing the Trump administration and the possibility that your visa may not be renewed, you may very well decide to go back to India or some other place where you're more welcome. So this is not just hostility to people out there in the world that will be hurt and will have difficulties moving around where there's economic opportunity. This is, in fact, us shooting ourselves in the feet, both at the low income level, all the service industries, and also at the higher professional level, where we're very needy for foreign doctors, or at least foreign-born doctors, and so on. There's relatively little discussion of how the Trump policy on immigration and the political policies that are being visited upon other countries in the world, including our former allies in Europe, also reflect onto the United States and will increasingly make the economic life of this country really, really difficult. I think it's hard to say if you live in Detroit or New York or whatever, the degree to which the ICE raids, which are also coming to our parts in California, are not only doing horrible human rights violations to people, but as you might have noticed in the newspapers, some people are being arrested and disappear in jails and facilities in this country and other countries, who are in fact American citizens, who are green card holders. They're having their green cards withdrawn, or the green cards will not at the moment entitle them to move into citizenship, even if they had a citizenship date, and so forth. So the havoc, I guess I'm suggesting, is not just international havoc, but it is also havoc increasingly in the United States. And generally speaking, one would argue that a government which pursues international policies, which not only harms others, but even harms the country that is propagating those policies, one should ask very many questions about that. And it is, useful to see that the international system is changing, but it's changing in part because of, for example, Russian invasion of the Ukraine, but it's also changing in part because of the US still acting like a big international actor, is interfering in the possible solutions of, let's say, the Ukrainian situation. Let me just spend 2 minutes on the Ukrainian situation. Delegates from the United States, Wickoff, others, have gone to Russia and essentially are in the business, as is Trump's son-in-law, are essentially in the business of organizing investment and business deals in Russia, and have very little sympathy for the Ukrainian situation. On the other hand, Europe is quite freaked out about the Ukrainian situation, because if Russia rules the Ukraine, or the Ukraine is not protected by the United States and the European Union, there is real concern that the attacks on Poland, which have already taken place, some bombings, the attack on Moldova, and so forth, and eventually back up to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, people in Europe are quite scared that if the Russians aren't stopped in the Ukraine, they will just simply move beyond. So that the reason Europeans are taking such a strong view about having a reasonable conclusion in Ukraine and ending this conflict is not simply their love for the Ukraine, but is very much a self-interest and the self-interested motivation, as is Trump. That is to say, Trump's interest in the resolution of the Ukrainian situation is self-interested, but not in the same way that the Europeans are self-interested, but rather because Trump feels fairly sanguine and to some extent favorable to Putin and the Russian regime. And they certainly have economic interest, his family does, and so on, in Russia in the future. So alienating Russia over the Ukrainian situation is very modest, I would say, at this point. And at this point, what the actual outcome of the Ukrainian situation, we will have to address down the road. Now, finally, let me say a couple of things about the Western Hemisphere and the Venezuelan situation. You might have heard on the evening news programs, what we're doing there is illegal by international law. The law of war, the law of the high seas. It is simply illegal actions, no matter how you look at it. But the Trump administration, as I mentioned in the beginning, has very little concern about international law, international courts. So the fact that everybody's screaming, this is all illegal, I think they could care less about, actually. And on the other hand, our fellow citizens, and maybe many of those of you listening, are very favorably inclined to say that the drug trade is playing havoc in the United States, and we have a national interest in trying to do something about the drug trade. But as you may have also heard, Venezuela is not the main source of drugs that come into the United States. Originally, we even said it was fentanyl. Venezuela does not make fentanyl. And the drugs are coming from Colombia and then through Central America and through Mexico. So what was said about all of this, to begin with, made no particular sense. Second of all, we don't actually know what's in those boats or who are in those boats. And third, this may all just be an excuse for terrorizing the current government of Venezuela to quit and leave, because the real mission is really to overturn the Venezuelan government. There's no other explanation for the huge military and naval establishment that has taken place in the seas in front of Venezuela. Whether we go legally or illegally on land, and probably we might. Will we have a full-time invasion from external? Probably not, because we can probably accommodate our desired ends. But and it's unclear how this is all going to end. You might know the ironic situation where one of the biggest drug lords of Honduras, who was charged and given 40 odd years of prison time, has been pardoned by Trump. So at the very moment that we're blowing up these little boats out there in the high sea to get rid of drugs, one of the biggest drug lords that has existed was pardoned. So none of this is logical anymore, is my point. And I could go on and on about that. So the illogic is something that we as citizens and listeners need to pay some attention to. Because if you just listen to the news, it sometimes sounds, well, yes, of course, blah, blah, blah. And then you listen to the next piece of news and saying, isn't this contradictory from this other policy? And the answer is indeed. So on the one hand, there are totally messy and contradictory policies. On the other hand, we're dealing with all kinds of legal actions. We are not necessarily in a very strong position to tell the Russians that what they're doing is illegal, because the Russians know as well as we that the U.S. does illegal things whenever it suits itself. So we need to pay attention to this, and there's lots more to say about this. In the meantime, the situation in Gaza is hardly peaceful. Israel controls half of Gaza, and Gazans are being killed right and left as we speak. The situation in the West Bank is even worse. The settlers are killing Palestinians right and left, and are taking over much of the territory. A two-state solution seems rather fictitious at this particular point. Meantime, Syria is celebrating its first anniversary after having overthrown its previous 50 years of dictatorship. But Syria is in deep, deep need for economic and other assistance. Much of housing has been destroyed. Much of electricity isn't working. They are really living under serious duress. And it would be very nice if the United States and Europe would have the bandwidth, both intellectually and financially, to help Syria so that it doesn't retrogress. But at the moment, we are otherwise engaged in only really the BBC, and a little news here and there about Syria's anniversary is even coming into our news channels. The Iranian situation, the nuclear situation, is still unclear. The civil war in the Sudan is killing more people than are killed in any other part of the world, and it's hardly getting any attention. And last but not least, the fact that we have gotten out of WHO, World Health Organization, and the fact that all our aid to Africa and elsewhere to help people with AIDS and so forth has stopped, is leading to thousands of people dying from AIDS because they no longer have the medication they needed to keep them alive. In other words, we are part of a killing machine of innocent people because of our domestic policies, our cessation of USAID and funding for these programs, our withdrawal from WHO, our mess in the State Department, where many knowledgeable people are no longer working there. And historically, we will have much to answer for, it seems to me. But in that sense, it's a historic first, because we all grew up at a time when we knew we had many domestic problems, but we also knew that the US was, in some senses, on the right side of history, putting the post-World War II world back together again, helping countries get on their feet, helping people with health needs and so forth. And at this particular point, none of the above is happening. And not surprisingly, China and its policies, and to some extent, some smaller countries in India, are coming to the fore as more interesting or important actors for many, many countries in the world. How this will all play itself out is complicated, and we'll surely get back to those issues as well. So thank you very much for listening. I'll see you again in 2 weeks.